Okay. Oh, that sounds good. Well, welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight to this Faith and Science Forum. I am Richard French, Doctor of Medicine and the MC tonight. Tonight our speaker will be Dr. Kevin Horton. And before we get started, we have a few announcements. So we have our live audience. We'll have an online audience. And we're going to see some photography from drones from Dr. Horton, where he has mapped out some amazing geologic features in the western part of the United States that are strong evidence for a massive flood event, such as the one that we read about in Genesis. If you haven't visited the Boneyard Museum in Broken Bow, it is open on the weekends, and it's a very fascinating tour that Brian Young has put together there. Our next forum will be January 14th, and of interest, the last January's forum on January 9th a year ago, Andrew Jones showed photography and evidence in the Ararat Mountains of Turkey of a formation that's the exact size and many of the features of Noah's Ark. So it may be the real landing site. But that forum that we showed last January now has had 500,000 views online, which is incredible. We want to thank the E-Free Church for letting us meet here every other month. And so, before I introduce the speaker, let's have a prayer. So, dear Lord God, creator of heaven and earth, thank you for creating us as human beings. Thank you for your word, the Bible, and your living word, Jesus. Thank you that you have revealed to us and are revealing even now through modern science your awesome super intelligence, your awesome creative powers, so that everything in the known universe and every living thing points to you. So open our eyes to see and our minds to comprehend you better as Kevin Horton shares his message with us tonight. So a few words about Dr. Kevin Horton. He's a doctor of veterinary medicine. He received his degree at Iowa State School of Veterinary Medicine sometime around 1990, and he practiced as a veterinarian in Montana for 20 years. Then he became inspired to earn his Master of Theology degree from Moody Institute in around 2011, and he's pastored churches in Montana, currently at the Crossroads Christian Fellowship in Victor, Montana. He's written books. I have one called Genesis, the Foundation of Everything, which is an excellent read that I would recommend. He has a DVD teaching module called Genesis Academy. It's 12 CD discs or DVR discs or DVD discs that cover the first 11 chapters of Genesis. So his presentation tonight, as I mentioned, will be aerial footage from drones that show geologic formations of a massive flood event in the western United States. So let me turn this over to Dr. Kevin Horton.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that introduction. I must correct one thing. I graduated from veterinary school in 1981, so I've got a few more years on me than it appeared. But what I want to tell you is it's very interesting that a country veterinarian who became a country pastor is now teaching geology. So it's really kind of a strange situation to find myself in. But sometimes somebody outside of the field can see things that people who've been trained the right way to do things wouldn't ever think of. And a silly drone has turned out to be phenomenal in being able to look at the features of the western United States and say, oh my goodness, there's strong, overwhelming evidence that this was a massive water flow coming off the rising mountains. And so we're going to show that tonight, and that hopefully you'll really be excited about the evidence that is right in front of us about from Noah's flood. It's right here. We see it all the time. I'm going to focus a little bit on Nebraska too, because, well, that's where we're sponsoring out of. So we'll do that. I'm the director of the Institute for Biblical Authority. Let's see, that's not going to work that way. So we'll do it this way. Our website, just so you know what it is IBA777.org. And I lost my screen. There we go. And there you can watch this video, or actually some others, and also some from other world-class Bible speakers, as well as people like wall builders and American history, and some others that we've had. We have their talks recorded and put available on our website. So I just want to make you aware of that. Okay, well, I am the director of the Institute for Biblical Authority in the big metropolis of Hamilton, Montana, which is quite a bit smaller than the town of Hastings. So just so you put it in perspective. And our purpose is to communicate the Bible as trustworthy and authoritative, beginning in its first word in Genesis 1:1 and extending to the last word in Revelation 22:21. And you can see up there in the corner, the right corner, I have a picture with those words in their original language. The one with the darker letters are Hebrew, lighter letters are Greek. So the Hebrew is the first word of the Bible, Bereshit, which is translated in the beginning. And then the last word is Ponton, which is translated all. And a lot of people go, well, I thought it was maybe amen. No, it's all. May the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. And it's a great end of a magnificent book that we have, the Bible. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about my drone videos. And some of you have seen some of this before. There's a lot of updates. You're going to see a lot of new stuff. There are some things that I have discovered, and I want to just say I discovered, well, a team of us at various times have taken trips across the Western United States, and we have discovered these things. It's quite alarming to me if I was not in the creationist camp, because the evidence is so overwhelming. But let's start with this little video so we put things in perspective of what the issue is here. Just a second there. So isn't it interesting how we can see the secular view where that we've been lied to about Noah's Ark since we're children, but the worst one is what is biologos. And so I went out to biologos to one of their seminars, and they're the ones who said the scientific and historical evidence is now clear. There has never been a global flood that covered the entire earth. Biologos. Now notice. They stand on God's word and God's world. The trouble is they let science guide their interpretation. They deny that's what they do, but that is actually what they do. They let science, being the way we interpret science, to help them change how they interpret Scripture. Now, you might think that's fine and dandy. They can do that. I've never heard of biologos. Oh, but they're having an effect on us. Take a look at this. It's a fairly common song, very beautiful song. And by the way, the first time I heard it was at Biologos conference, and I'm singing along. And it starts out really good. God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time, before Bereshit, when time begins. At no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of light. As you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. Many of you heard this song, right? And in the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. That's beautiful, beautiful. But now let's go on farther. And as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch their breath, evolving in pursuit of what you said. Whoops. They're evolving. And you see, this is creeping in even into our songs. The idea that we evolve. That's why when I see Biologos saying that the scientific and historical evidence is now clear, there has never been a global flood that covered the entire Earth. Wow, that's a big statement. But I'm going to tell you, my drone says absolutely otherwise. And what you're going to see is some phenomenal evidence today that shows us, that's right in front of you in Nebraska, evidence of the flood of Noah. So we have to start with the issue. So we need to get this straight. What is the issue here? Well, the issue is deep time versus a young Earth. So if you think about it in this way, if you look at the layers of the Grand Canyon, and if you can see that hypothetical little bracket there and say that's a hypothetical set of layers labeled A, from a deep time perspective, that might represent 3 million years of slow processes depositing those layers. On the other hand, if it's a young Earth perspective, it might be just simply 1 week of flood surge that laid down all of those layers all across the continent. And by the way, many of those layers depicted here in the Grand Canyon can be found with continuing across into Europe, They're big layers, not little layers. Point is this: if you believe that the Bible is trustworthy and the flood of Noah was an actual event, then these layers here that we see in the Grand Canyon originated in the flood of Noah. And that's radical. That's radical. Is it defendable? Oh, I think so. So here's the point further. If the flood of Noah then is a historical event, then deep time is a myth. Those layers that are supposed to be millions of years old aren't. By the way, they're flat layers on top of another flat layer on top of another flat layer, and some of them have 1 million years of erosion between those layers and they're flat. Wow. But that would mean deep time is a myth. If this was cut by, if all these layers were made by the flood of Noah, deep time is a myth, then evolution has no time to happen. Do you see that? And if that's the case, then evolution is a myth. Evolution is a myth. All right, I'm going to take you to a canyon. I took this picture. I'm looking south, and this canyon's approximately 400 feet deep, cut through solid basalt rock. That's volcanic rock. And I'm going to ask a simple question. Some of you know the answer to this, but many of you don't. How many years do you think it took to cut this canyon? Now, we can measure the amount of dirt carried out by this canyon every year. And if we measured it out with the spring floods and the lower flows and figured out how much sediment is cut out every year, we could then measure how much is gone and figure out how many millions of years it took to cut the canyon. But we actually know how long this canyon took to cut. 3 days. I paused there intentionally. 3 days, because some of you are going, what? We know that. Now, that's from the Lake Missoula flood. This was cut by a flood in 3 days. All right, it could be off. I could be off. It could be 2.5 days. It could be 3.5 days. So I've averaged to 3 days, and that's figured out by how long it took the water to drain out of Montana across Washington State where this is cut. Now I took this picture looking south, and I turned to the left, and I'm looking straight east, and there is Palouse Falls, a beautiful state park in Washington State, in the middle of nowhere, but it's a beautiful park, and that falls is incredible to look at. Notice this little thing. I actually had been there a couple times. I never noticed that. Then one day I was reviewing my photographs, and I went, wow, look at that. Turns out they call that the crown. So I went down and looked at it. Look how narrow it is. This is a side view, and there's a side view and a front view, and you can see how narrow it is compared to its length. It's pointing the direction of the water flow. And so if you look at it closely, you can see all these little rock finger projections. And I asked myself a question. With every year, there's rain, there's ice that forms in the winter, and there's cracking. How many millions of years do you think those finger projections will last? Well, we can say a couple thousand, but that's about all. And that brings up the cause of this, the Lake Missoula flood, the glacial Lake Missoula flood. And this is from the Ice Age. How many ice ages did I say? The Ice Age. There's good reason to believe in one ice age that came out of the conditions that caused the flood, heated the ocean, and caused a lot of volcanism, which put a lot of precipitation in the sky, or not precipitation, but particles in the sky. And with the heated oceans, you have a lot of evaporation, so you have an ice age develop without the snow melting very much. All right, so this is Glacial Lake Missoula flood. Some people ask me, how long ago was it? I would say about 4,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. The guy who discovered it was a guy by the name of J. Harlan Bretz. His first name was J, and it was spelled J. So that's how it was spelled. Well, he was a school teacher, high school school teacher in Seattle, Washington. And about in the early 1900s, around 1913, 1914, the first topographical maps of Washington state were produced, and he got a hold of them. Here is one of those maps. And you look over on the right side of that map, and you see very flat country. And then now on the left side, you're looking down into the Columbia Gorge, and then in the lower right or lower left, there's that big, whatever, it looks like a big area. That's a big canyon land area, and we're going to fly over that. And it's astonishing. That was all cut by the Glacial Lake Missoula flood. But when Bretz got these photographs, nobody had heard of this thing. Nobody named it. Nobody knew it existed or happened. And so he said, I got to go out there and look at that. And so he spent his summers taking students with him and mapping out on foot, because there weren't many roads out there, much of what we now call the scablands of Washington state. Scablands as if they were an unhealed wound in the land. One of the other things he discovered was this. He discovered a 3-mile wide waterfall in a desert with no water. Wow. And he found deep plunge pools below the rim. So there was water that came through here, but it's gone. And it's been a long time. And then I noticed this thing sitting out there. So I went down and looked at it. And look at that. It's hundreds of feet high. It's got a semi-flat top. It's got sheer cliffs and it kind of got a shoulder that looks like rubble coming down it, but it's just been some, they call it talus when it breaks off the top there. But most of that was there when this thing was first formed. Well, Brett started to understand that there was some massive flood that went across Washington state. He didn't know where it came from exactly, but he knew it originated somewhere around Spokane, Washington. And so he called it the Spokane flood and started writing papers. Well, eventually, the Geological Society of Washington, Washington, D.C., convened a special meeting to specifically deal with Bretz. And Bretz was called in to present his material. And at that meeting, he said he felt like, later he wrote in his memoirs, it felt like I was before a board of elders to correct the young protege. And here's one of the quotes that came from that meeting. What Bretz proposed was too much like a biblical flood. I stop there and say, what does that say? That says we don't allow interpretation of data that would bring to mind the biblical flood. That's what it seems to be conveying to me. Well, while he was at this meeting, there was another guy from Missoula, Montana, and he was a geologist there by the name of J.D. Pardee. Now, Bretz had only studied Washington, and so he had really no idea where the water came from, and that was one of the big things that everybody went after him at. And J.D. Pardee supposedly leaned over to one of his fellow attendees, and he whispered quietly, I think I know where Bretz's water came from. Really? Well, see, Pardee was from Missoula, Montana, right near where I live. And this is one of the things he saw. You can see this in Missoula almost any day, but when the snow is just right, I took this picture years ago from an older cell phone, but you can see when the snow is just right, you can see those lines going up the side of the mountain. And they're like somebody put a level on there and drew a line. Well, that's from water line. As the water rose, with the dam at the Idaho-Montana line caused by ice, a lobe of ice slid down and went over the top of what is modern-day Sandpoint, Idaho, forming Lake Pend Oreille. That blocked off the Clark Fork of the Columbia River. No drainage out of this area. So a lake started forming, and every year it went higher and higher as the spring melts occurred. And when it did, then during the summer, the wind would blow, and it would blow predominantly from the northwest, putting lap lines on the side of the mountain. And here's a drone shot I took of Missoula, and you can see this, they call them strand lines, those are lake lines. You can sort of see them on Mount Jumbo, and I'll move you in closer on that. Here's Mount Jumbo from the University of Montana campus, and you can see those lines. That is from the lake and the water lapping across there. That is one of the things that J.D. Pardee saw that told him there was a lake here at one time. He didn't know about the ice dam, didn't know about the ice age, but he could see evidence that there was a lake here. Okay, we're going to pause and we're going to take a little hiatus. We're going to take a little rabbit trail, if you will, and I'm going to take you down to the Sea of Cortez. One of my sons lives down in the LA area and he works in the film industry. And during the winter months and he sometimes in the summer too, when he's just totally tired of the city, he rented a little place down in the Sea of Cortez. And when I talked to him, and we're coming down in January this one year, he said, "Dad, this is a strange place. When it's high tide, the water's right up along shore. But then when it's low tide, it's like a mile out there to the water of a mud flat." Let me show you. So here's my wife walking our dogs, and you can see the little village area where we were staying. Well, that's walking towards it. Of course, there's little channels that will be left behind. But as you start to look out, now I'm turning the opposite direction into the sun, and you can see the shore way out there. Now I'm getting farther out. You can see how far it is to the shore. I turn the other way, and there is the seashore. And it is flat as can be, but also I want to call to your attention water ripples. As the water goes out, it leaves behind these little water ripples. You can tear them up, you can dig holes in them, you can pick up all the starfish you want, and sand dollars, etc. And then the water will go out again, and it will remake those water ripples. They happen by the movement of water. And some of you have seen them in the bottom of streams. All right, well, Pardee saw something else. So now I'm about an hour northwest of Missoula, and it's in a little spot that's along the road called Camas Prairie. About at the end of the road, as far as you can see it, is the town of Camas Prairie. And there's this little pull-off commemorating these giant water ripples that are left on the side of the mountain. And so as I pull back and we're videoing this with the drone, I want you to call attention to those trees because we'll see them again. Now, off in the distance between us and the trees, you can see something that looks like little ripples right there. See that? But you really can't make it out. And that's about all you see from this beautiful little spot. Well, let's get up with the drone. There you see them. Those things are 45 feet high. That's the little water ripple in the sand. That is huge water ripple in the sand. Look right down at the very bottom. You can see a road there to get your perspective. These are monstrously high. You could put a three or four story building in the bottom one and not see it from the bottom of the next. And there's the trees up there, and you can see water flowed one way, and you can see the water flowed a different direction. Let me show it to you from those trees again. You can see there was water rippling way up there in the top, and they go a different direction. They'll go perpendicular to the ripple marks. Can you see them now? This is a still photo. You can see them, they're going at about a 45-degree angle to each other, maybe 60-degree. All right, so that is one of the things that Pardee saw. He saw the water ripples and he saw the strand lines, and he knew there was some kind of lake here that, with the water ripples, had to cataclysmically burst. So where was it? Well, right there where that red circle is the Montana-Idaho line, literally by the G of glacial, even where the ice dam arrow points. That is literally the Montana-Idaho line, within a mile. And that whole thing, that lobe of ice, blocked off the river, and you can see Missoula is marked there, and the water was 950 feet deep over Missoula. Farther south of Missoula, where I live, it was 650 feet. But at the ice dam, it was 2,000 feet deep because you're going downhill. So it's 2,000 feet deep. Well, Pardee saw the water ripples that said this thing burst suddenly, whatever it was, and he saw the lake lines, so he knew something had happened. Now, what did happen is that dam burst, and the water went ripping across through what is modern day Spokane and then spread out. There, by the way, is Palouse Falls that I showed you a little earlier. We're going to look, first place we're going to look is right there, and that's right near Spokane. And then we're going to move over to there's Dry Falls, by the way, that I showed you a picture of, but we're going to spend some time right in there, and that's called the Potholes Cataract area. And then we'll finally go down to the Walua Gap. There's a gap there where the water got stopped and backed up. And if you go towards Yakima to the west or left, it made a temporary lake they called Lake Lewis. And so then the water worked through that gap, which is 1.2 miles wide. It's huge, but the water flow was so big it couldn't get through. Then it got to Portland, went down the Willamette Valley, which is right in this area, and then eventually found its way out to sea. So that's what happened. Now let's take a look what kind of structures are left behind by a massive flood. This is the one near Spokane. I want to call to your attention, you can see water channels. That's important to understand because we're going to see those and they are big clues. Notice as we look at these little buttes, these are about 70, 80 feet high. They are flat topped. You can see that they often have a sheer cliff and then a shoulder that comes off of that anywhere from 30 to 60 degree angle. There's that flat top. There's another water channel trying to break its way through this butte complex. And the main flow of water went around this butte complex and spread out, and it left them behind and eroded everything else in its path away. The interstate runs out there in that flat area. They don't want to run through this. And so you look at what's left behind by the Lake Missoula flood. Again, get used to those dimensions. The flat top, the sheer cliff, don't always see it, but sometimes you do. Here we just see a sheer cliff and then it goes right to the bottom on this little one in front of us. You can see water channels all over the place here. You see them right there? But we're going to see something else up here that's coming to view now that is unique to this area, or at least I thought it was. And that's what's called pothole lakes. They have like a 45 degree angle bank. And notice as we get up to this other one, even though it's not round all the way around, it's kind of like somebody took a router bit around that and kind of 45 the bank angle all the way around. And there is why they call it the scab lines. It's not useful for much because it's all ripped up. That is what happened from the Lake Missoula flood. All right, so those are our general dimensions of these butte-like structures. They're flat top. It's not perfectly flat. They got water undulations, but they're fairly flat. We have that 90-degree angle cliff. Then we have that shoulder that is anywhere from 30 to 60 to 30, 60 degrees. And then the blue are the water channels that are trying to work their way through. So water is still flowing enough to try and cut through, but as it diminishes, it never makes it all the way through. And so we also see some of these erosional remnants that are flat top pointing the direction of the water flow. And that becomes important later on too. And then, of course, the pothole lakes, and they have this kind of round shape, even kind of oval egg shape. And they have the banks that are rounded like this. And you wonder what in the world caused this. It took a long time to figure this out, but that's turbulent whirlpools. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of water action that will help you understand these turbulent whirlpools and some of the effects of water when it's flowing fast and runs into various impediments like a rock or something in the stream. In this case, I'm going to show you an irrigation ditch by my house. And it's coming out of a culvert and then it expands wide. And when it expands wide, the water eddies back and goes the opposite direction to fill in and makes a circular flow. You see that? It's eddying back. And if you watch some of these balls come around, they start to go back the regular direction, and then sometimes they get caught up in the eddy again. So you can see those balls floating along, and that is an eddy. If you've ever canoed or paddled on rivers, you've probably run into eddies. All right, now I'm going to show you when you get water flowing a little faster. This is from Glacier Park, Avalanche Creek. I filmed this a week or two ago. And what I noticed as I was walking along there is, look at those. Those are rounded areas. How did they get there? And then farther down on McDonald Creek, I started to see this, and I was watching it, and I was seeing, look at that foam now. Watch the foam. Do you see it spinning in a circular, almost turbulent whirlpool fashion? And if you had faster flows, it'd even go faster and cut rock harder. But you can see it's those turbulent whirlpools that cut those rounded holes in the formation of rock. And so we see the origin of these pothole lakes is from turbulent whirlpools. Further down, we run into something called Frenchman Coulee. It's right off Interstate 90 heading towards Seattle. It's flat bottomed, it has sheer cliffs, and guess what? 45-degree angle shoulder. Off in the distance is the Columbia Gorge. Notice this weird thing there. I just saw that. That looks like a thumb sticking up, got left behind. But look at the sheer rock. These are hundreds of feet high. I would say I estimate 500 to 600 feet from top to bottom. And this little thumb thing, or like a little cathedral, is erosional remnant. It got left behind. And I wondered why it was there. And then I realized it has to do with the hanging canyon. Well, you say, what? Well, it's a hanging canyon. You see, if this canyon was formed by slow erosion, it would have cut its way all the way down to the bottom. But it was starting to erode that way, and then a larger flow cut it off, left it hanging. And so you have what is called the hanging canyon. And out there in that area, you can find anybody, some guys running their drones like me. All right, what did we learn? We see flat-bottom stream beds with 90-degree cliffs and 45-degree shoulders. We find hanging canyons left because of water flow changes, and as the water flowed down that main canyon, it cut off the water coming through the smaller canyon, and it left it hanging, so it never eroded down to the bottom. Okay? Now look at this flat countryside. And look what's in the middle of it. I told you we would look at the Potholes Cataract. Here it is. Flat as pancake countryside. And then we have this torn up area with these lakes and cliffs and plunge pools. And I was reviewing this video about a year ago, and suddenly I recognized, wait a minute, what am I seeing coming up on the left there? So I slowed it down. Look at that, a 45-degree angle bank. Then there's water channels cutting out. And this looks like a whirlpool-caused pothole lake. So I just recently went back to video it. That's this. You can see that little Heart Lake is clearly a pothole lake, two others by it. And you can see the water channels that cut through by the turbulent whirlpools, most likely, almost certainly, and then found an exit before it hit the waterfall and dropped 400 feet down to the rest of the water. And you can see this is all cut during the action of massive water flows. All right, so we continue on, and there was a massive waterfall here as well. And this waterfall was flying way past that sandbar and curling back and left that sandbar deposit. And notice the bank of that sandbar is like at a 45-degree angle, and it's about 70, 75 feet high. And this is an erosional remnant left behind. Everything else got washed away. See, it was trying to cut through there. The water flows were. Notice the dimensions, the same dimensions we've been seeing. But also notice that that dimension is the same as across the way. Looking down at it from the top, it almost looks like a spine of a dinosaur bone left in the dirt. It's very interesting, but notice it's fairly flat on top. That was cut by the water early on to be flat, and then it cut everything else away and left this behind. There's a water channel cutting through. We look back at this And we can see, again, it looks kind of like the spine of a dinosaur or something like that. Okay, so Glacial Lake Missoula geomorphological observations. I get that from the big guys. One is this planation surface above the canyons. So we'll look at these different things here. We have a long ER or erosional remnant pointing the direction of flow. That's the box. And then number two, and that's where we see this ER here. That's erosional remnant. And that section looks like it's the spine of a dinosaur. And then number two, we have deep plunge pool below the rim. And then finally it goes to a flat bottom creek bed below that. We also find vortex channels coming out of pothole lakes and cutting their way through the solid rock. Another picture of that is here. And this picture I filmed just this summer. I also got poison ivy going down to get that. That was nasty. But there's the vortex channels right there. And that's what we see there. Now, I'm going to take you out to, this is the Wallua Gap. Remember I told you it was 1.2 miles wide? Well, I noticed that little thumb thing there. So I went in. It's not little, it's huge. But in perspective of that big gap in the river, it is rather small. Notice that it has a similar elevation, but this whole area has been turned round like stovepipes. But they go straight down, and then you have that shoulder, but it's on a kind of a cliff, almost a shoulder on top of the shoulder. And look at that. It looks like stovepipes put up there, multiple ones. How did those form? And now you're looking down the Columbia River in the distance there. There again are the stovepipe formations on the top of the rock. They're rounded. They have a certain elevation. There's a cliff on it that's lower. Not all of them are going to be that way. And then notice the shoulder. The shoulder drops at about a 45-degree angle sharply down to where the water flowed through. And you can see that there. So take a look at that. So that's an important thing. So we see these cones and towers are another thing that are formed. And it was my hypothesis that this was caused by turbulent whirlpools. This is a side channel. And I was thinking you had whirlpools cutting around, giving that round shape to the rock. That's my hypothesis. So for whatever it's worth. Now to get a size comparison, here you go. That little speck down there is me filming this. So you get an idea how big this country is. Okay. Now, what causes these formations during the Lake Missoula flood? Well, first, the planation surfaces. And we call them planation surfaces because they're like a board being planed down flat. And that is from the initial flood stage, the high water stage. The water is spreading across Washington State, hundreds of feet deep, rolling and turning like it's like a blade on a planer, cutting it flat. And so if we have rough cut boards, the old way we used to do it is we would plane those down that way. Now we put them in a machine, and it has rolling blades. And there's two things to note. One, it comes out flat. And number two, there's going to be all sorts of material left over. It's going to be washed out to sea or washed into different places and formations. Second thing, and so that's caused during the sheet flow phase. Now, what causes the flat bottom creek below? Well, it starts to channelize. As the water gets lower, it's going to kind of pull together and cut a channel. But with enough water pulls together, it's going to plane that down to the next level as well. And then what about the flat-topped erosional remnants? Well, the sheet flow phase cut the whole countryside flat. And then it channelized and left that behind. And so that's how you get those dimensions. Pothole lakes, again, that's we learned by turbulent whirlpools. And finally, hanging canyons, those are caused because during the channelizing phase, one canyon gathers greater flow and cuts the other off. And so the water just essentially stopped and flowed the other way, and it never eroded down beyond that. Okay, that's the first part of our talk today. And now would be a good time to take some questions.
Well, thank you so far, Dr. Horton. So we'll take some questions.
How, yeah, one question. How did that show? Did it go okay? Could
Yeah,
you
it was
see
very
it?
good, very good. I have a question.
Okay. Yeah.
One of the first things you showed was this canyon, and you said, we know that was formed in 3 days.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
but you didn't tell us, I don't believe, where that canyon was and how we know it was 3 days.
Okay. I alluded to it, but for me, sometimes these things are so well known, I forget to make it clear. So I appreciate you asking me that. It is Palouse Falls. That is in about mid Washington State, near Lewiston, Idaho, Clarkston, Washington. They're across the Snake River from each other, and about 20, 30 miles northwest of there. And that is from Lake Missoula flood. When the dam burst, that was cut in the 3-day period of time. How do we know 3 days? Well, we know the volume of water that was backed up behind there. There was more water in that ice dam than Lake Erie, the Great Lakes of Lake Erie and Ontario put together. And when that dam burst, it was catastrophic, 800 feet high at Spokane. And then it spread out across the state and planing everything down. And then eventually it'll start to channelize, and that's when it cut the Palouse Canyon area. And then the water's gone. And that was about 3 days it would take to drain. That's how we know.
Okay.
Great question. I'm glad you asked that.
Thank you. Other questions so far?
Question of how big was the lake itself compared to, let's say, the Great Lakes?
It was probably quite a bit smaller by comparison. It's long because it's a river, so it's following the Clark Fork of the Columbia River and to Missoula, and then outside of Missoula, about 40 miles in various directions. In the Bitterroot Valley, it was about 55 miles south, and from Missoula, and as you go upstream. And so it covered from, like I say, about 50, 60, maybe 100 miles east and north of Missoula and south of Missoula, and then to the Montana line. Let me show you that one picture again to give you that orientation. Oh, but I shut it down, of course. I'll have to bring it up just a second. Take me a second. That's the wrong one. Up. And it's be this one. And let's go here. Let's bring that up one more time, if it will. You coming? Maybe it's coming up. Maybe it's not. Does not want to open. Maybe I won't show it to you. Let's not mess it up. Oh, wait. Are we here? Yes, we're here. Okay, it's here. Right here. So let me move this, and let me just put this on as if we're there. So if you can get the idea of Missoula, remember it's it's following the river. Can you see my pointer? Does my pointer show? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can see it, yes.
You can see the pointer. Okay, so this is the Clark Fork of the Columbia River, and then there's a big part of the lake that's up here, and Camas Prairie, by the way, is right here. I don't want to do that. Sorry about those circles coming in. That's Camas Prairie where the water ripples are. So all this water is running off of there. That is associated with Flathead Lake now. And then from Missoula, it goes this way and heads up in various directions around Missoula, but not very far this way. It just gets narrow. So you see it's kind of a narrow band, but the deepest spot is 2,000 feet deep. So it is very, very deep. And so it's a lot of water concentrated in a river and in river valleys. So that's what we see there. Okay, make sense?
Sure, thank you.
That's the best I can tell you on that. I'll give you some kind of comparison. Okay, anything else?
Dr. Demick.
Perhaps you're going to come to this later, but I'm curious about the rest of the story about J. Harlan Bretz and what happens to him.
Yes. Well, for 40 years, he was in geological no man's land. I mean, he still went out to Lake Missoula and to Washington State and did some studies for a while, and then he eventually ended up in Chicago as a geologist, and he did okay, but he was in geological no man's land for his entire career. Then, and this is kind of cool, aerial photography. All right, this is airplane aerial photography. You can't miss it. You can see the water coming down. So just go to Google Earth sometime and you can see the water lines coming out of Spokane, and you can see exactly where the water did, even to this day. And so aerial photography proved it. So in the 1950s and 1960s, he was totally exonerated, a little bitter. I don't think he was real forgiving, and I can't say I can blame him because he'd done good work. And most of the people who were critics had never been out there. But then they gave him the highest award of geology. I forget the name of the award. And so there was some makeup for that. But it has forced geologists to say, well, floods can do some things. At least they're saying that. Great question. Thank you.
Dr. Horton, I'm still lost as to when that dam broke. It sounded like you said
Yes.
4,000 years ago, but to me, nobody was around 4,000 years ago. At
Well,
least
there
the-
might have been some. Yeah. How we get the date, that's a good question. Obviously, nobody wrote down the date. If they did, they wrote it down to their death. So unless they were up on a mountainside or something like that. I suspect there were people there for good reasons. And that goes into a study in the Ice Age. But secular geologists will tell you 1,300 years ago, 13,000 years ago, sorry, 13,000 years ago. Biblical geologists will say 4,000 years ago, the Ice Age began. 4,500 actually, right after Noah's flood, which would have been about 4,500, so 4,300, somewhere there, the ice is starting to flow, build, and probably lasted as much as 700 years before it ended. And so as the days were warming, the dam was getting up to its full measure, and it eventually burst somewhere between 4,000 and 3,600 years ago. And that's based on a biblical geology. Timeline from the Bible when Noah's flood was, taking the ages of the people and their children literal. And so that's how we get that date. Otherwise, we don't know the date.
Okay, thank you. We'll let you proceed.
All right. Now comes the fun part. Now you've got some basics, and I have told people, once you get this, you'll never see Nebraska, you'll never see Colorado, Utah, Arizona, you'll never see it the same. And when you see pictures around the world, you go, oh my, look at that. And so it's going to change everything. One little story. I was in Canyonlands National Park. Actually, I was in Moab, and somebody saw the sticker on the side of my truck that says Institute for Biblical Authority, and saw me filming and stuff, and asked me, what am I doing? I was filming one of the mesas you're going to see in a little bit. And I told them what I'm seeing. And then I ran into them about 3 days later in Canyonlands, a little farther to the west. And they said, oh my goodness, this is everywhere. So what you're about to see is everywhere in the West. And so it's really cool where you live. From there to Colorado, to Utah, to Arizona, to New Mexico, you're going to see these sort of things. And if you come up to Montana, you'll see the same things there too. All right, let's see. I probably have to start my second slide. Where are you, buddy? There we are. And I didn't get the other one started. So I'm going to shut this other one down so we don't get too much on here. I split this up because it gets to be such a big file. It can really mess up a computer. Fortunately, we bought a very high-end computer that doesn't cause us, we don't have nearly the trouble we used to. All right. All right. Can you see my picture again? You see that now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, this, by the way, was one of my early drone shots. This is the Flathead River. I was just coming back from Camas Prairie, my first time there, some of the videos you saw with the water ripples. And I took this picture looking down. You would never believe that it would look like this from the ground. It just looked like kind of muddy water, but it really is quite beautiful. All right. let's get this screen up, and here we go. Now, if we think about, this is a little graph that I got from Michael Ord, and he got it from Tass Walker in Australia. And Tass Walker kind of thought, okay, let's take, excuse me, let's take the biblical flood narrative, that would be Genesis 7 and 8, and let's map it out and see where everything, how it all fits. And so he saw that the peak of the flood was around day 150. So that's where you see the middle of that graph, and you see a number 3 above it, right in here. And so this is the middle of the flood in terms of high point of water. And this means that the water was above every mountain at least 40 feet, 25 feet. And that would be what it would need for the ark never to run aground. So that was kind of the point of that number. So when the floods start, it's going to go as a peak up, and during these stages, we're going to see different things happen in the flooding stage and in the retreating stage. So let's start with the flooding stage, and this is where destruction is happening. All the sedimentary layers are being laid down after flood surges destroy everything. So think this through, that during the first 40 to 60 days, all these layers are being laid down. Now, they're not cut like this, so you can see them. They're just being laid down on top of each other, on top of each other, on top of each other, packing down. More surges come, and it's just terribly, outrageously destructive. And so they're first being destroyed, and then they're being laid down. And then we have the sheet flow phase. And that is where you're starting to plane things down. And so we get planation surfaces around the earth. This one is the Madison River Valley near Bozeman. It is flat as a pancake, or looks like it. It's not perfectly that way. Then it drops down to the Madison River, which is flat, and then it goes back up the other side to some buttes that are flat. And that's happening during that stage. This is from Dickinson, North Dakota, right out of Dickinson, where I grew up. And there's a flat top butte. I saw that almost every day on my way to high school. So those are flat top buttes. Those are being cut flat during this stage, during the early planation stage of the flood. Then the water flow starts getting lower and it starts to channelize. And so then we're starting to get canyons form, we're getting plunge pools, erosional remnants are getting left behind, and pothole lakes. And so this picture is from the glacial Lake Missoula flood. You can see it's somewhat flat on top and then flat down the bottom. And that's what happens as water volume drops. It cuts channels flat down below. All right, with that introduction, we're going to move away from the Columbia River drainage. In other words, nothing here has anything to do with glacial Lake Missoula flood, other than you're going to see similar things, but bigger. And they aren't from glacial Lake Missoula, they're from the Genesis flood, or the flood of Noah. So not terribly far from you is Chugwater Creek, Wyoming. And in fact, the first time I filmed this, I was on my way to Nebraska. So this film is going to show you some planation surfaces. And there's the interstate that heads down towards Denver. But look at the creek bottom. Now you see the meandering creek down there. The question is, the creek cut this, or is the creek following what was cut by the flood? And I'd say it's the latter. The creek just follows what was left behind. See those little bumps there? I first thought they were water ripples. There's something. They're related to water flow, but I can't say for sure they're water ripples, so I don't make a thing of it anymore. But look at how flat it is up on top. And then look at, it drops down, and then you have a flat bottom again. And also notice here again, the dimensions, same dimensions we've seen all across from Lake Missoula flood. And so we look out there and we're going to see this again. Now I moved over to the other side. Look at those channels coming out there. How did those get there? Well, I'd say the best answer is, if you look off in the distance, you see that planation surface, the water's coming off of that sheeting, and it starts to channelize and going down into the Chugwater Creek drainage. And those are all formed during the final stages of the flow of water off of Noah's flood. And so we see flat bottom creek beds with steep cliffs, just like we saw in Lake Missoula flood. There's one Lake Missoula flood and there's one from Chugwater Creek. And by the way, you go over the top of that and you're going to run into Nebraska, and we're going to be over there in a little while. And that's a planation surface up on top, much like that planation surface from Lake Missoula right by the Potholes Coulee Complex over to the very far right. All right. Now, I'm going to take you twice to the Beartooth Mountains, but you ought to see something right there. Isn't it interesting? You see the 7,000-foot high creek down the bottom, but look up at the top, and it's semi-flat up there. Over on the right side of the screen, you can see the Beartooth Highway working its way up that. If you've never been on that road, it's worth the trip just to go on that. It's phenomenal. But when you get up on top, look how flat that is. How did that get so flat? And we see that as just kind of like it's a planation surface. Now, this doesn't drop off into cliffs. It's like channels were cut, so it's different. But I have no doubt that that's by water running off the top of this and then coming into these various channels into these canyons. And so we can see it's not perfectly flat, but it is a planation surface. So that's one thing we see in the Beartooth Mountains. Now, the second thing we want to look at is for erosional remnants, and that would be buttes and mesas. Some of these are caused by volcanic intrusions through the newly formed sedimentary rock. So you think about that sedimentary rock at Noah's flood was soft, and the mountains are rising up, and the magma's pushing and being pushed around up there, and things like the Devil's Tower forms under the sediment, and then everything gets washed away and leaves that hardened rock behind. The sediment was softer, and so that we can see this thing somewhat flat on top. That's a laccolith butte that's made by, it's kind of a volcano throat, if you will. There's another one here in Montana, just over the top going on into the prairie by Lincoln and Great Falls, Montana. This is called, I just lost it. Crown Butte, sorry, there we go, Crown Butte. And it's some of my first videos, so the lighting is kind of goofy, but it's good enough. And notice there's a canyon cut into this butte. It's not that big, and there's a canyon cut in it. And then, in fact, we see on top of it water channels. And I'm thinking this butte isn't big enough to form water channels. The water's going to fall off the edge of it. There's not enough water to accumulate there. And I just looked at this going, wow, this is a strange place. How did these water channels form? And then it looks like they continued on off into the distance. Now, this is called the Sill Butte. So the magma came up and then squeezed between layers laterally and then cooled and left this kind of columnar formation. It's kind of weird looking, but it is quite interesting. But as I look at the side of it, you can see that there's water channels through this rock coming down. See that? And I thought, there's never enough water coming off of that to form those because the water's flowing away from there. But then we see the same standard dimensions, 90-degree cliff, 45-degree shoulder. Lifting up, you can see the water is actually running away from the edge, and yet there's water channels down the edge of it. And then there's water channels on top. And what bothered me is, look off in the distance. There's the Rocky Mountains off in the distance, and these water channels are going the other way. And then there's some coming off the edge of this thing. How did this all form? A very interesting thing. Looking down below the butte, you see a water channel that's coming from the Rocky Mountains. And by the way, that little speck out there, you can barely see is my truck. So I found that this drone can make you lazy. But look at these water channels on the edge of this thing. There is no way that would have happened. See how the water should be flowing away from the edge. So how did they form? And then the water is flowing from the Rocky Mountains that way, but this is going back towards the Rocky Mountains. I was trying to figure this out. And then it's kind of got a C-shaped edge, like the river channel was, the water channels were bigger than this Butte is. Very interesting little thing. So my question is, how did those water channels like that form? And if you look at them, they almost look like they were longer and got cut off. And that, I think, is what happened. So we see these erosion channels flowing the opposite to the water flowing from the Rocky Mountains. And I realize this is an eddy back. And his water's going around this rock in the middle of the stream, and then it flows back and is cutting across the face of it. And some of it's flowing down the sides, and it's cutting those channels along the side of it. Oh, about 20 miles away is the city of Cascade, and that's just down there by that river. I see this is called Cascade Butte. Look at the water channels there. And in fact, from the side, look at them. Isn't that interesting? It's like there's little loops there. And that was almost like this water channel was much longer, and then the stream came through and cut it off, leaving the bottom end hanging. Remember how this one from Lake Missoula had the water coming down and then cut the bottom off? This one looks like the water came through and cut the top off, leaving the bottom still there. Very unusual, massive flows of water to do that. And there again is that little U shape there. All right. That's in Montana. This is just over the border into Wyoming, the Beartooth Mountains. This is a Beartooth Wilderness. I added this little section just because it's too beautiful to pass up. So it's just gorgeous country. And I found out you can fly your drones from outside the wilderness over the top of it, but you can't fly it from inside. So I'm outside the boundary by about half a mile, and I'm flying my drone above this beautiful country. And that's why it got called the Beartooths, because it looks like teeth up there, flat topped. Isn't that interesting? But I'm gonna call your attention to this. This is called Beartooth and Clay Buttes. Beartooth Butte is on the left and Clay Butte's on the right. They're kind of connected. I'm flying over it. This is sedimentary rock. Everything else in the Beartooth is bare Creation Day granite. This is on top. Everything else has been washed away and left this. There's a little notch there from when the dirt was that high. It was starting to flow there. Then for whatever reason, it started to flow around this thing and left this erosional remnant behind. Fossil-bearing erosional remnant with the standard dimensions in the middle of a granite field. So there was, on top of all that granite, these same layers, but they got washed away as the mountains rose up. And God left this behind to let us know that, this is from the flood. That's why it's left here. And we're getting to this red area. You can see almost in the center of that red, a little tower, like a little thumb sticking up. How many millions of years do you think that would last? And the red is iron-bearing rock. Look at the top of that section. It's very flat. I'll show you that again in a little bit. Again, you can see the standard dimensions, aren't you? Flat on top, sheer cliffs, 45-degree angle base. Same as we see from the Lake Missoula flood. There's another tower in the yellow clay coming, just passing on the left there as we're going by it. And you can see the Beartooth Wilderness area, just gorgeous area, 10,000 feet and above. And obviously my drone can fly that high, so that's really cool. But look at here on the top of that butte, do you see how flat it is? So that was the layer which it all was, and then it got washed down and everything got washed away except this was left behind. All right, so that's the Beartooth and Clay Buttes. There's strong evidence of water rushing off the rising Beartooth Range, removing everything but this little erosional remnant was left behind. Now, the Beartooths are at 10,000 feet. Where did the water come from? We're seeing massive water erosion, leaving behind fossil-containing sedimentary rock. Where did the water come from at this elevation? There's no lakes above this. That's above it would have any flow that could ever wash this away. Where did it come from? Well, the Bible tells us. And Psalm 104, the context, yep, I think it is correct. The mountains rose, and the valley sank down to the place that you appointed them. And that is speaking of how the dry land came out of the water at the end of Noah's flood. All right. Now I'm going to show you another erosional remnant. This is one of my favorites. This is fairly new. And by the way, the arrows I'm going to show you are pointing the wrong direction. I put this together quickly for another event, and I didn't even notice I put the arrows the wrong direction. But this is called Factory Butte in Hanksville, Utah. And I filmed this one day. I made a mad 600-mile run. The water's going the other way. I don't know how I did that. Okay, the water's going south, and this pointing south, north and south. It's going the other direction. But notice that it's 1,600 feet from the top to the floor. That's the one in Lake Missoula. Arrows go wrong way. But the one in Lake Missoula is only 600 feet. This is monstrously big. Monstrously big. Notice the top of it. It's flat. By the way, there's the one from Lake Missoula. I'm showing you it there. Look at this one. Looking down the back of it, you can see it looks like kind of a dinosaur spine. And this one, you can see it would look like that too. And I'm going to show you that shortly. But this is like crazy out there. It is like, you see it from miles and you go, whoa. I was able to just get high enough with my drone to fly this thing. And the wind was blowing 25-mile-an-hour steady, 40-mile-an-hour gusts, and filmed that smooth. I can't believe how well it did. And you can see on the left, that's from Glacial Lake Missoula flood. Notice it looks like the spine of a dinosaur. What is this one? It looks like the spine of a dinosaur. You know, the spinous processes of the backbone sticking out of the dirt is what it looks like. So compare them as they're going along. Well, it sure looks like the same kind of formation. And the one on the left is from Lake Missoula flood, a massive flood. What do you think caused this one to be the left out in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere? Utah. Well, it's from the water rushing off the mountains as they rose up after Noah's flood. And for whatever reason, it left this behind. You see the top is quite flat. As we compare those two left and right, coming to the edge of it, and looking down, and it looks like a place that you just wouldn't want to crash an airplane. So in the middle of the desert. Okay, I know you've had time to think, but here we're going to take you, well, stop for a minute, pause for a minute. I'm going to take you out to near St. George, Utah, a little bit below it, and I'm going to take you to Hurricane. And some of you thought, oh, that's Hurricane. No, not if you're local, it's Hurricane. And what you're seeing here in front of you is called Monkey Butte. It's a mesa. Notice the standard dimensions. But also look up on top there. You see that black road? It's actually a railroad track. Here, we're going to start it again, I guess. I guess it starts over. And here we go. And so this has got the name of Monkey Butte because in the 1950s, they built this railroad track to oblivion. They put carts on there with rocket engines behind them, accelerated them to 600 or 800 miles an hour, and shot the monkeys off the butte. I'm waiting. I'm not there to hear the, what? What they were doing is they were developing ejection seats for fighter pilots. I don't know how many monkeys survived, but it did save many men's lives. But as I go down from Monkey Butte, what did I see? I can't believe what I'm seeing. Do you see what I'm seeing? We're seeing lap lines as the water is dropping. You're seeing shorelines going lower and lower and lower as the water is dropping from Noah's flood. It left the butte behind, and there was another level of butte or mesa above that. That got left behind. Then it came down and left the Monkey Butte, and then it came down to here, and it's leaving shorelines as evidence of the flood of Noah, dropping water levels. How in the world will this happen in a desert other than this? There's no way it would leave those levels like that. And so we look at this and we can see good evidence. This is one of the strongest evidences of a flood. We see evidence of dropping water levels during a massive flooding event. They're in a similar way that we see the strand lines in Missoula, but those are from the water, the wind blowing and showing different levels as the water rises up. This is from erosion as the water is going down lower and lower and lower and lower. And it left us lines giving evidence of dropping levels. Okay, down to Moab, Utah, very near Colorado. It's down in a hole. And then there's these cliffs above it. And so I thought, well, let's see what's up there. And that's kind of how I do things. I'm out somewhere and I'm camping. I said, what's up there, I wonder? So there's Moab there. This is from Google Earth now. I'm showing you Google picture. And I'm camping right about there. And I just put my drone straight up and look what I see. There's the LaSalle Mountains to the east. What do you see? Water directional fins. Well, I call them water fins. That's my new name. From Google Earth, you can see them. You see that? And you can see where the water came from across from the LaSalle Mountains. Now, Moab wasn't cut yet. So this is all one level coming from the LaSalle Mountains. But notice the Abajo Mountains are coming from the south, and they meet that flow, and they curve right into that flow. It's so amazing to see that. Now I'm going to move out about 50 miles to the Needles Overlook. And I'm going to take a picture from here, but I'm going to fly down the bottom of that canyon, 1,500 feet lower. There's the Abajo Mountains. And look what I see down in the bottom of this canyon. Water fins coming from the Abajo Mountains at the bottom of this canyon. And this is right on the edge of Canyonlands National Park. And you can see this is water flow. It's just pointing the direction of water flow from the Abajo mountain range. So looking at it again from Google Earth, you can see the various flow directions, but there is the LaSalle Mountains, and the Abajo Mountains are to the south. And so one main flow came this way from the Abajos and made those lines. And then another flow came from the LaSalle and made those lines. And then that's those from the LaSalle. And then this is from the Abajos. And you can see they curve right in and join the flow and join up. And then we see another level down farther. And so these water fins give strong evidence of directional flow, water flows from the rising mountain ranges. Exactly as the Bible expected. The mountains are rising up, water's rushing off, and we're getting evidence of that water flow. Okay. Whew. All right. Now we're going to take this a little closer to home. Look at that green spot. For those of you who don't know, what is it? And I'm going to help you. It is the farthest east portion of the Rocky Mountains. What is it? It's the Black Hills of South Dakota. Then what is that white stuff down to the south and east? Most of you should know that is the Badlands of South Dakota. Now, I grew up in North Dakota and we had our Badlands, but the Badlands of South Dakota is something weird. It is like totally different. It's like somebody dumped mud, sculptured it, and left it there on these flat pan places of soil and sod. And so here's a little video I took one July, I think it was 2 years ago. And notice the points on the top of that. And then notice how flat it is down at the bottom. It's like somebody dumped mud there and then kind of sculptured it up with all these sharp points that are millions of years old. Sandstone. I don't think so. I don't think they should be there. In fact, I saw a couple of rainstorms and it washes a lot of sediment off of those. They can't be millions of years old. A little farther out, for those of you are golfers, and by the way, you can see water channels coming off of this, and there shouldn't be these deep channels where there's no place for the water to gather. But here's where you tee off, boys. You tee off there. You have a huge sand trap all around you, and you have a little fairway down there. Good luck to you. So, but look how flat this is. It's flat on top, it erodes down, and then it's flat down on the bottom. And on this particular July, it had been a wet summer, and so it was still very green, so it really stands out nice. But you can see how flat that is here, then it drops down to the next level. And by the way, look at this ridge here. Doesn't that look like a dinosaur tail? Kind of does, doesn't it? Like we're seeing the ridge of a dinosaur tail. Not that I'm making anything of that, other than just it looks like that. Okay, water ripples. Do we see any of those? Well, I see some real giant water ripples. You have your orientation now, and you can see these water ripples. The water flow is going this direction. But if we move over farther, it's going a little bit this direction because we go perpendicular to the ripples. And then over here, it's going at that direction. And so over here we have, over in the corner, is the Black Hills, then the Badlands, and the water was coming this way to hit the sandhills of Nebraska. And we have water coming this way, and we have water. And so I think that was kind of coming around. And then we have water coming this way. It's coming around. It's being forced by eddy. So we see that it's like these water ripples. Here are the water ripples of Montana. There they were then. That's Camas Prairie. There it's from Google Earth. Here's the water ripples. But that's a third, two-thirds probably of the state of Nebraska with those water ripples. You know them as the sandhills. We're told that that's blowing in sand. I'm going to say to you, I don't think so. I think as the Rocky Mountains rose up, it caused an eddy that caused water to slow down and circulate back and drop the sand there. And then the finer sediment, it slowed down closer. It got close to the Black Hills, giving us the sediment that would be for the Badlands. I want you to see how those ripples look the same as that. So if we look at your Nebraska sandhills, we can see the Badlands of South Dakota right there. We can see the water ripples have flow from these three directions. And so I surmise that the water is coming around from the Black Hills, and it's going to be eddying back in a sense. Some of it's going to eddy back, and it's going to come this way. It's going to be pulled in, so it's got a little curve there, and then this one's going to be pulled in the other direction with a little bit of a whirlpool eddy in the middle there, leaving us that light sand deposits that would have filled up and then eventually be eroded down, which would be the Badlands. So the coarser sands are out in Nebraska where the water didn't slow down as much, but slowed down enough to drop the sands. And then as it got up closer, it swirled back closer to a Rapid City, it slowed down more and left the finer sediments there. Okay, we might have questions about that later. All right, pothole lakes. Do we see them anywhere outside of the glacial Lake Missoula flood? Well, we do. I'm taking you up 700 feet above the desert floor, northwest of Moab, Utah. And I was flying here and I looked down. Do you see what I see? Do you see that? In fact, you see pothole lakes all over up here, and they're round. In fact, you can see almost like in the glacier formation where it's cutting these little notches in as well. Do you see there and there? So we're seeing what looks like pothole lakes from massive water flows 700 feet above the desert. How did they get there? How in the world did we get this massive number of pothole lakes? Look at that ridge. And by the way, I always find them on the edge. Now, look in the upper corner. That's from Lake Missoula. I didn't know they were there, but I went back and flew this summer. Look at that pothole lake in the center there as well, in Glacial Lake Missoula, right here. And I found that after I saw these. And I said, well, if they're here, they should be in Lake Missoula. And sure enough, they were there. Look at those amazing little lakes. Okay. That, I believe, is huge evidence of massive water flows. I don't know what else you could attribute it to. Now let's get closer to home. Chimney Rock, Nebraska. Most of you have probably been there. It's not that far away. Notice the dimensions. Can you see it? 45-degree angle. Then we have this little tower up on top. It even has a little edge of it along our shoulder that's there. And then on the very top, you have the crown that is rounded. Isn't that interesting? Isn't rounded like before? But notice also, you see those cracks? This is sandstone. I renamed this the clock tower, because what it's doing is it's a ticking clock that's saying this is not millions of years old. Look at this photo. This thing lost 30 feet in the last 150 years. And look at those cracks. Another 150 years, you're going to see it shortened by a lot more. The clock is ticking. It's not millions of years old. This happened rapidly from the flood of Noah not that long ago. All right, one more cool place. And this is in Utah, over by Zion National Park, closer to St. George in the southwestern part of Utah. And I took this picture because one of the guys with me said, Kevin, you got to film those rocks. They're just gorgeous. And they are. It's just beautiful to look at that. And you can just see the different layers that you can see some flood surges changing direction as this is going higher and higher and higher and higher. But then what's up on top is shocking. I didn't expect to see cone-shaped structures up on top. Look at this. It's like a cone field. When I saw this, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Look at that. How did those get up there? And they're got to be 400 feet above the bottom below. And so here's another section of it, and you can see they're round, and with these sedimentary rocks, it looks like little stacks of coins put on top of each other. And you can see the one right in the middle now. It looks like a perfect little cone coming up there. And there's all these cones in this area. How did they form? Now, it was my hypothesis that this is turbulent water, and then I flew up farther, and there it is. There's the evidence. It was turbulent water. There's a whirlpool lake right up on top with cones. And then you see where turbulent whirlpools went up these canyons and formed these cones all over the place and caught these little canyon edges, these little side canyons. See that? How that's rounded right in there? That has got to be cut by a turbulent whirlpool swirling up into there as the water's going by from each side of this ridge. Is causing eddies back that's causing this tremendously turbulent area. And this is right on the edge of Zion National Park. And I say it's on the edge because I can't fly in Zion, but I can fly on the edge, and I did. All right. Are you ready for your final test? You're going to get it whether you like it or not. Here we go. I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to say too much. I'm going to let you, I'll just tell you what was happening. You keep your eyes open and see what you see. This is Delicate Arch in Arches National Park. It's a good hike up to that spot. I was up there. You have to walk around this corner so you don't fall into that hole. And where that guy's standing, you fall off a cliff that drops 600, 700 feet. What's that right in front of you? Nobody sees it. Nobody knows what it is. You know what it is, don't you? Look at that. That is clearly made by a turbulent whirlpool on the top, 600 or 700 feet above the desert floor in the middle of a terrible desert. And there must have been water flows up there to cut that. And I'm suggesting that the water was cutting around this, leaving this as two towers, but it didn't cut the top off. And so it left it as two towers with a cover on top. That got left behind. You can see it now. Now notice in the distance, there it is. There's a cone right there that we'd expect cones to be associated with a turbulent whirlpool. Are there other cones around here? Nobody else knows to look for it, but you do now. What do you see? Look at that. They're all over the place up there. How did they get there? Well, we know, and you can see it drops off sheer right here. Where that little girl is in the blue coat, you do not walk 5 feet off to the side there. You will fall down 700 feet. And there is Arches. And now you see it. Now I'm going to show you Arches from a distance. I went out and took a look at it. And you can see the cliff right here off to the right. Look up above. Here is Delicate Arch. So you can see it there. There is that whirlpool lake that's dry because it cut out and gave an exit so water doesn't fill there. So we don't recognize it as a lake. And those are the cone field up on top. Water had to be flowing up here, folks, to form this, which means it was massive flows. And it had to happen in the one-time event as the water was running off the Rocky Mountains as they're rising up out of the ocean. All right. Your final test is now set. Most of you have seen this picture before, Monument Valley. A very famous place on the Arizona-New Mexico border area. What do you see now? You see the cliff? You see the flat bottom creek? You see the erosional remnant with a flat top, sheer edge, 45-degree shoulder? Look at that little guy. Now let's look here from down the bottom. Glacial Lake Missoula flood caused that. Notice the cliffs, the shoulders, the flat bottom down below. Look at that. We saw those little butte things. Those are 70 feet. Those are hundreds and hundreds of feet high. And then look at that guy. Let's bring him in. Look at that. And look at that. There and there. Monument Valley is a monument to the flood of Noah. All right, so that means then in Monument Valley, where all those monuments are, the water used to be, the dirt used to be on top of that. And it was plain flat, and then it channelized and washed all of that dirt away. Where did the dirt go? What happened to it? It went to the Sea of Cortez. And that is what you see in that armpit of the Sea of Cortez with those sand deposits that go out a mile. In fact, in the very armpit portion of that, you could literally walk all the way across the Sea of Cortez, 40 to 60 miles on this dirt that's left there from Monument Valley, Grand Canyon, and all the flows from the Colorado River drainage that drained into the Sea of Cortez. BioLogos says, this is the Science and Bible group. The scientific and historical evidence is now clear. There has never been a global flood that covered the entire earth. I tend to disagree. Okay, there we are. All right, so questions on what we've seen.
Well, we have a little technical correction to make, I believe, so we might have to wait a minute or two to get the questions. Is that correct?
How did the video go? Did it all go okay?
The video was great.
Okay, good.
So they'd like to take about a 2-minute break before we ask you questions. Is that all right?
That's good because I didn't bring water. I'm going to go get some. So, okay, I'll be right back.
Okay.
So you guys take that break and then we'll get questions.
right. Dr. Horton, are you still there?
I'm here. Yeah,
Well,
I'm
we
here.
have reset our equipment, and now we're ready to give you some questions. So we'll open
Okay.
up the floor to see if anyone else has anything they want to bring up.
Well, there wasn't much we went over, so it probably won't be any questions. In other words, I know it can be a bit of a brain overflow. So fire hose.
Harriet has a question.
Okay.
On, on the last pictures where you were at the very, very top, and when you looked around and there were like the round holes and everything.
Well, sure. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, first of all, how long did it take for the water to go down out of the holes so it was eventually empty? And if so, then were they full of seashells and clams and fish and all kinds of stuff, or was it just a big?
Probably not. Probably not. Because you got to remember that there were layers on top of this, that they were all formed during the flood. So there may be, many fossil layers are just dirt. And certain layers are full of fossils and other layers don't. And I don't really know what was in that layer, but you got to remember there were layers upon layers above that. And as the mountains are rising up, water is sheeting off, cutting everything flat. And you have to think of this almost in three-dimensional and in steps. So as the mountains are coming up, there is a couple miles deep of sediment on top, and the water is still under the ocean. As the mountains are rising up, water is getting displaced, and it's cutting all of that dirt off the top until it finally starts to peak up above. And as it starts to peak up above, it's going to start to channelize. And of course, the mountains are peaking up higher, and then it's going to start to channelize. And when it channelizes and goes around an obstruction, it's going to start to eddy. And so that's what we see later towards probably the latter end of the flood. Now we're still 700 feet above what's going to be the eventual floor. So there's still a massive amount of water coming off the mountains, and it's flowing. It's going to cut all that area all the way down to Moab and the areas around it, and down to eventually down to the Colorado River bottom. So it's just keeping cutting down, but it's leaving those erosional remnants behind. But when they were just starting to be left behind, you had a lot of serious eddy action happening at that interface along the top edge of that. And that's where I find these whirlpool lakes, along the edges of something left behind, an erosional remnant of some sort. So it's along the edge of it where the eddies occur and makes those whirlpools. So it all happened, though, in probably 150 days. And most of those were cut during a short period of time, a week or two, and it was gone. And they're just left there for us to see. Great question.
I'd like to know, you said that the ice age was quite a bit after all of this. Would that have slowed any of that down and possibly started again once it started melting?
Let's see. Yeah, Ice Age was after what we saw in the flood of Noah. What I have done, I used to have some other videos from areas in the Beartooth Mountains that the trouble is the glaciers had an effect too. And so it was hard for me to tell, was this caused by Noah's flood or caused by the glaciers? And so I didn't use some of that. And so you'll notice that a lot of what I use is farther south, Nebraska, Utah, in those areas that are not affected by the glaciation as much. So glaciers probably didn't have much effect in the area in southern Utah.
Where are you
Does that
going
make
next?
sense?
Yeah. Where are you going next?
Good question. I'm planning to be in Arizona this winter for a week or two with my boys, so we'll try and do some of this. Yeah.
Kevin, a couple of questions from online viewers. One question, could arches have been formed when Grand Lake drained? Wouldn't the arches collapse if they were still mud right after Noah's flood?
Yeah, good question. Well, there was many layers on top of them, so they've compacted, but they still are somewhat soft. I would think, although it could have easily cemented at least partially by that time, but how much I don't know. That's outside of the realm of my understanding. So there's that part. What was the other part of the question?
Well, would the arches have formed when Grand Lake drained, forming the Grand Canyon?
Ah, if there was a Grand Lake, that's debatable. I'm more inclined. I'm going to give you my feeling on that. My inclination is no, the Grand Canyon was cut catastrophically as the mountains are rising up. So that's where it's taken me a long time. I used to say there was a Grand Lake. There's, you can make a case for it for sure, and I used to. I'm more inclined to think that it was cut catastrophically when the mountains were rising up.
Um, Last question, online question. Uh, Amazing footage. Thanks for sharing it. How much have you invested in your drone and software to produce
Oh
these
gosh.
videos?
Oh gosh, we talked about that IBA board. Just the computer that I'm using right here to do this cost us just short of $5,000. And we bought this after I finally was ready to throw my other one against the wall 2 or 3 times because it would freeze up all the time showing this stuff. And so I had to get one specially made that could handle this level of video material. The first drone was about $1,500, and the second drone was about $1,500, and the third drone was about $1,500. There is a learning curve to flying drones. So, but fortunately, the latter two were covered by insurance, so we only got stuck on buying 2 of those. Then we eventually bought this current drone, which is like phenomenal, and it was $2,000, and the controller was like $1,100, but well worth it. And it flies out 5 miles. And many of the pictures that you saw that are the more recent stuff, Factory Butte and the little ripples, lakes up on top of the mesas are all filmed with the newer drone, which is way better. So that was about, with the insurance and everything, it was about $4,300 for that. So, and then we have travel, and oh my gosh, I bet you we have $25,000 to $30,000 to come up with what we've come up with right here. And that's doing it without paying me or anything, just giving us mileage to get out there and get back. So yeah, very expensive.
Well, it looks like, one more question from Dr. Demick.
Yeah.
To get a little closer to home here, you showed the pictures of Chimney Rock. Do you have anything
Yeah.
to say about? Oh, okay. Yeah. Do you have anything to say about Scotts Bluff and Jailhouse Rock and that series of buttes along the Platte River?
Well, certainly, as you look at the Platte River, that's a great question, because you look at the Platte River, and I actually wanted to study it more today as I was thinking about Nebraska. But I did a couple last week. I was looking at the North Platte and South Platte and how they flow off the Rockies, and you notice they have a fairly flat bottom, and then they have those cliffs. And if you look, they have the shoulders, the 45-degree angle shoulders. So all of those structures come from the water running off the Rockies, but then it finally gets low enough that it starts to channelize and then cuts that layer down low. And all along there, I remember when I was coming through, I cut across from Chugwater Creek over to get to the Scotts Bluff area, and coming across that area, and I saw all sorts of little chimneys all over the place along the edge of those rocks. And so you can imagine there were some little whirlpools, all different places. And I didn't have enough time to study those to see if there were even maybe something else that obstructed it, like a hanging canyon or something that would make those stay. But they're all related to that water coming off of, in your case, on the North Platte, coming from Wyoming.
Well, if just a hint or a comment for any future research with the drone you may do, but I'm just thinking of when I've been out there in the past and been around Scotts Bluff, and I believe it's on the downstream side of Scotts Bluff. There is a little formation there that looks an awful lot like what you showed us of the Crown.
Ah, really?
And- and
That'd
the-
be interesting to see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd love to see what you could do with this in the future.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
it's called the camel. This little
The
small
camel.
formation because it looks like a kneeling camel with a head at one end
Oh,
and
really?
a hump behind it. So
Oh, that would be fun to. I wish I'd known that when I was driving by there. I would have swung in. Well, next time I'm out there, I will do that. I will have to do that. Very good. I would like to just tell you this too is I did have this reviewed by the Creation Research Society geology team, and got good review on it. And the Institute for Creation Research is going to publish a book, and I'm working on just starting to write it and compile it this week. That should be out next spring, summer, which will have photographs of all of this and then help you go through it slower. But it'll also have QR codes that will take you to a website that will show you videos then that explain that further of what we just saw in those formations. So that's coming out with the Institute for Creation Research probably next spring, summer sometime.
Well, thank you for that. Just a final comment from an online viewer. It's a comment. In Weld County of Colorado, there are gravel bars north of Colorado Highway 14. Lots of cobbles, river rocks, and I see ripple marks on these gravel bars. He says,
Oh,
thank you for confirming what I've been seeing. So it just
oh yeah, it'd be fun to put a drone up there and see what it looks like from the air. Yeah. Okay, great. Like I said, you'll never see the West the same again once you've seen this. You'll start to see things everywhere. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Horton. It was mind-boggling, beautiful, fantastic photography. So we appreciate you spending time with us tonight. Yes, let's give him an applause.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure. My pleasure to be with you.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
So for our audience, our next forum will be January 14th at 7 o'clock right here. So you'll get more information as we get a little closer to that date. Thanks for coming.